talk about Tadashi Imai. That's what this video is about. Tadashi Imai is a Japanese director. He was active from the 40s through to the 1980s. I think he did some work in the film industry in the 30s as well, but as a director, I think he started in the 40s, if I'm not mistaken, but like in the late 30s, I think he was working on stuff too. And he directed a film called Revenge that was released on Blu-ray by Eureka Entertainment, which is a Region B Blu-ray, so just if you're in Region A, which is US, Canada, Mexico, like that kind of area, it won't play on your standard Blu-ray player, but it is a great movie. I've done a video about it for this channel. I did a video about it for my Hong Kong cinema channel. And after I watched that film, I was reading about Tadashi Imai, because I didn't know that much about him. And I stumbled upon something on Wikipedia that I thought was kind of interesting, and I thought might make an interesting video topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about criticism that I read of Tadashi Imai as a filmmaker, and talk about my perception of that criticism. It's really just two little pieces of criticism that I saw. So I'm going to read this to you and kind of give you my thoughts on it. And it's two, like I said, it's two separate kind of pieces of criticism that they will kind of dovetail together. But I'm going to talk about one first and then the other. But then let me first read you what I read on Wikipedia here. So it says, while film historians acknowledge Imai's solid directorial skills, the lack of a consistent style and a tendency to focus more on consequences than analysis of his themes have been recurring subjects of criticism. So there's two sources cited for this criticism. One is a fantastic book that I've actually read multiple times, which is called The Japanese Film, Art and Industry, which was written by Donald Ritchie and Joseph L. Anderson. Donald Ritchie is an absolute legend of the Japanese cinema kind of community in the English language. So Donald Ritchie moved to Japan. I think he was in the military. If I remember his biography correctly, he was in the military. He went to Japan after World War II, during the post-war years. He married a Japanese one. He lived in Japan for decades and decades. He was a film critic when he was in Japan, and he wrote about movies and stuff like that. He wrote about culture and other things of that nature. He was on the set of Throne of Blood, which is a Kurosawa film released in 1957. It's an adaptation of Macbeth, the Shakespeare play. For my money, that is one of the best movies ever made, full stop. Not best Kurosawa films, not best Japanese films, not best Shakespeare adaptations, not best, samurai, chambara, whatever you want to call it, Jidaigeki films. That is one of the best films ever made, straight up, period, full stop. That's mind-blowing that he was on the set of that film. And he wrote a book about Kurosawa, which I have read a couple times. I often disagree with his criticism. It's interesting. I have enormous amounts of respect for him. And the documentation that he did over the course of decades about the history of Japanese cinema and all these movies, and the advocacy that he did for them in the English language, the way that he promoted them and stuff like that. A limitless respect for him. I often disagree with how he criticizes movies. I think he's a little bit harsh. I think he's a little bit cantankerous, and oftentimes I don't see that there's a meaningful metric by which he's judging things. It oftentimes just feels kind of random that he's criticizing certain things. So I vehemently disagree with basically all of his criticism of films, but I have tremendous respect for him as a writer and as an advocate for these films. I should say that Joseph L. Anderson is not somebody I really know that much about, but he's the co-author of that book. And then the other piece of criticism comes from a book entitled Critical Handbook of Japanese Directors from the Silent Era to the Present Day, and that was written by Alexander Jacobi. That came out in 2008. That's a relatively recent book. Never read that one. Don't really know anything about the author. So this is not intended to be... I'm not trying to get in a fight with these authors. I'm not trying to say they're wrong. I'm not trying to, I'm not disparaging them or anything like that. I have tremendous respect for anyone who goes out there, studies Japanese films, watches these movies, writes books about them. Tremendous respect. So there's no disrespect intended in this video. But so let's unpack what we have. First of all, I think the first part of this sentence is condescending. And that is, while film historians acknowledge Imai's solid directorial skills, like the guy who was a professional filmmaker during the golden era of Japanese cinema, we're still watching his movies, 60, 70, 80 years later. You don't get to say solid directorial skills. He earned his respect. It's to me, that's just it's a little condescending. Like, he might not be your favorite, he might not be the most visually showy, he might not be the most philosophical or whatever, but like, he proved himself as a filmmaker. So let's get past like the underhanded compliments when we're talking about a career of someone like this. Lack of consistent style. This is just, it's just a bizarre criticism to me, and let me tell you why. I like to talk through example. And my examples that I use are not always obviously related to what I'm talking about, but I swear I will get back to my point. But it's a lot easier for me to think things through if I'm thinking of concrete examples than talking in the abstract, okay? So one of my favorite filmmakers is Coppola. Francis Ford Coppola. Apocalypse Now is probably my favorite movie. He made that. He did the Godfather films, which are incredible. He did the Cotton Club, which if you have seen the cut of the Cotton Club that Coppola intended to be released in theaters, which the studio butchered, he was able to get it out on Blu-ray maybe 5 years ago. That movie is freaking incredible. Bram Stoker's Dracula is one of my 10 favorite horror movies ever. I really think that movie is like a gothic horror masterpiece. Coppola is an incredible filmmaker. Coppola does not have, I believe, a consistent style. His movies are all really, really well made. He's an incredible visual stylist. He works with some of the greatest cinematographers ever. They do incredible work with the blocking, the visual design, the camera, and stuff like that, right? But Coppola has actively spoken about how when he finishes a project, he has this kind of symbolic thing of he wants to kill the artist who made that project and then come to the next project as a new director, as a new artist, and make the movie that needs to be made based on what the material is, to create himself again, to almost be reborn as an artist in the crucible of this new project, and then to kill that artist again and move on to the next one. So if you look at the Godfather films, and Coppola is very inspired by music. His father was a musician. He talks about this a lot in interviews, right? The Godfather, to me, is like a classical music film. It's slow and it's enigmatic. And I don't mean slow in a bad way. Like, it's very deliberately paced in this perfect, measured way, right? It's a very intricately made film. If you've seen the Cotton Club is about the jazz era. And it's buzzing with this kind of crazy energy. And it has these ups and these downs and these bursts of violence and these unexpected directions that it goes in. And it feels like listening to live improvised jazz, right? The styles of those films are very, very different. Apocalypse Now, the Doors are on the soundtrack. The soundtrack of that movie is very heavily synthesizer based, right? And Coppola has said that part of what inspired him to make that movie was talking to people who had been in Vietnam, talking about how they were doing a lot of drugs in Vietnam, and the idea of like the psychedelic hell of a war on drugs. Like, not the war on drugs, but you're at war and you're high off your ass, and it's like being in this insane version of hell, right? And so the style of that film, informed by like the Doors, a big drug band, right, is very different than the style of these other films, right? But you're not going to go and say Francis Ford Coppola doesn't have a consistent style, right? I've never in my life heard anyone say that ever. So to say that Tadashi Imai does not have a consistent style, so here's a lot of the problem that I tend to have when I read criticism there. I'm like, it rankles me a little bit, right? Is that they stop short of an actual criticism. They make an observation and they assume that is a valid form of criticism. He doesn't have a consistent style. That's an observation. That's not criticism, right? Not having a consistent style is not inherently bad or wrong. So this is where I kind of think of, when I think of this type of criticism, I feel like the brain of the critic is hitting a wall, right? They observe he does not have a consistent style. And then it's like, okay, good, that's a criticism. I'll write that down. I'll move on to the next thing. They don't keep asking the questions. Whereas, like, if you make things, if you are creative, if you are in the creative process, if you are an artist or a craftsperson or whatever, I believe you then logically ask the next question, why is there not a consistent style, right? Because intent is so important to artists. What are you trying to do? That's the most important question you can ask an artist. Like, if I work with screenwriters sometimes, right, who are trying to improve their scripts, or I've worked with like screenwriting students. When I was in grad school, I would sometimes like read scripts for other screenwriters or like undergrads who are at the same internship as me, and they'd be like, would you read my script for me or whatever, or like younger writers or whatever. And the most important question to me that you can ask anyone before you give them notes, before you really assess the thing, after you've looked at it, read it, whatever, what are you trying to do? Obviously, these people, they're not going to call Tadashi Imai and be like, hey, I noticed you don't have consistent style. What are you trying to do, right? But you could think about it. Because I found the visual style of Revenge. Revenge is one of the best visual movies I've seen this year, and the movies that are new to me, which was directed by Tadashi Imai. And the blocking, the camera work, the cinematography, the way the sets are incorporated into camera movement and staging, and I just thought it was phenomenal. So maybe he's not using that style in every movie, but it's not a criticism to say that, like, he's very clearly extremely talented visually. Just because he's not, maybe he's not a Tarantino who's like, from Reservoir Dogs onward, he's like, this is who I am, this is what I do, right? Or like David Fincher, who very much showed up with his style, refined that style as he went along. Danny Boyle's another one like that. There's tons of filmmakers like that, right? Paul Thomas Anderson, interestingly, very clearly changed his style partway through his career, right? You have The Hard Eight, Boogie Nights, Magnolia. They're like of a piece. Then you have this transition film with the, oh my God, I can't remember the title, Punch Drunk Love, Mattress Man, Adam Sandler movie. That's very different. And then from there, he goes into There Will Be Blood, The Master, which those films are aesthetically very consistent with one another. Inherent Vice kind of steps outside of that. And then he kind of goes back into that with, like a movie like Licorice Pizza has the same kind of like formalism as, I would say, a movie like The Master, right? So he doesn't have he has separate consistent styles in different phases of his career, but I've never heard anyone say Paul Thomas Anderson is not stylistically consistent, right? So that you can dredge up like a million examples of this, right? I'm not going to spend this whole video being like, well, yeah, but suffice it to say, the point that I'm trying to make is that's not criticism. That is an observation. And when you write that down and presume that it serves the purpose of valid criticism, you're doing yourself a disservice by not allowing your mind to continue. It's like the unfettered mind, right? The famous Buddhist book. The mind should never stop. It should be constantly fluid. Just ask the next question. Ask the next question. Ask the next question. What does that mean? Why is it the way it is? Like, and sure, there are probably filmmakers who like have no talent and like they have no interest in being talented, and they're like, they want to make money. They want to make like. Those people probably exist somewhere in the world. I mean, if I'm being romantic about it, I would say that everyone who sets out to make a film is doing it because they want to tell a meaningful story, or they want to do something interesting formally, or they want to communicate something that's important to them. Maybe that's not true, but I feel like critics, when I see stuff like this, and again, this is not disrespectful to anybody. I have enormous respect for all of these people and the work that they do, but that particular piece of criticism feels to me like you should ask the next question. Like, keep being curious. Don't stop. So the next piece of criticism here is the tendency to focus more on consequences than analysis of his theme. So to me, what this is saying is, within the context of the story, he's looking at consequences of character actions and things that occur, like the beats of the story, rather than doing like a deep kind of critical analysis of the themes, the events, the kind of the more philosophical side of filmmaking. To me, again, this is not valid criticism, because it's not criticism. It's an observation. Okay, you've observed from your perspective that I haven't seen enough of his movies to even know if this is true. But from what whoever wrote this, from what this person has observed, they believe that Tadashi Imai is not being analytical enough in the themes of his films, right? This brings up a lot of points and a lot of questions to me. The first one being, he has no obligation to be analytical, right? He, as an artist, a craft person, whatever you want to call him, he doesn't have to do what you want him to do. This is one of the things that I see in film criticism that I think is really interesting, is that oftentimes people will dismiss something or call it bad or criticize it because it's not what they want it to be, rather than trying to understand it as it is, right? So if I look at a movie it's just so different. Like, the way I look at movies is so different, right? Because I'm looking at creative choices and I'm just wondering why That's kind of my whole, when I watch a movie, obviously I'm watching it to be entertained because I love cinema, but a lot of when I watch movies, a lot of what I'm doing is just saying why did they do that, why did they do this, why is this character doing that, like, just that I'm curious, and I'm curious about the creative process and the decision making, right? So when you look at a movie and you observe it and you say like this, it's not analytical enough of its themes, right? What you're essentially saying is it's not what I want it to be. I would rather have a film that is analytical of its themes. A movie does not have to be what you want it to be, and an artist does not have to do what you want them to do. And if a piece of art or a movie is not what you want it to be, that doesn't mean it's bad. Maybe you could try to figure out why it is that way. Instead of, again, just stopping at the observation, have the unfettered mind and ask the next question. I want to talk briefly about Fellini. I'm a huge, huge Fellini fan. Fellini is definitely on my Mount Rushmore of filmmakers. Fellini made an entire movie about the struggle of the artist in the kind of the circle of everyone who wants you to be doing something that you're not doing, right? So in a way, 8.5, which is Fellini's movie about making movies, is about exactly what this person is saying. It's not analytical enough. There's a writer character in that film who's constantly criticizing the Guido, I believe, is the name of the character Marcello Mastroianni plays in 8.5. If you're not familiar with 8.5, it's a movie about a filmmaker trying to make a movie and having this like neurotic breakdown, basically, right? And it's kind of just about Fellini and his creative process. And Marcello Mastroianni, who plays the lead in the film, is playing a character named Guido, if I'm not mistaken. And there's this writer character who's constantly harassing Guido about, like, your script is not analytical enough, it doesn't address this, it doesn't address that, it's not. And Fellini, you could read in like interviews and stuff like that, like he was a member of the neo-realist movement originally, but he was very interested in like surrealism and like circus stuff and clowns and like all these things that don't really fit into the neo-realist worldview. And he started merging those things with neo-realism, and there was a lot of criticism about, you're not doing enough of this, and you have to, like, Fellini was just following his intuition as an artist and got enormous amounts of criticism that, again, was really just observation. You're not doing this. It's like, that's not bad. Like, Fellini had to be the artist he had to be, not the artist you wanted him to be. And we now will say 60 years later, 70 years later, 80 years later, a lot of people would say Fellini is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time because he was unique and he followed that intuition to do different things. Now, why I bring up 8.5 with particular relationship to this quote is, as I said, the movie is kind of about this idea of your intuition as an artist and your intellect as an artist, and those being separate things. And you want to marry them to some degree. Because, well, it kind of depends on what kind of film you want to make, right? Like, if you want to make a completely abstract art film that you don't care if anyone cares about it, you do whatever the hell you want, right? But if you want to make a movie that will make money back and that will allow you to make another big movie, then the phone is ringing. Let me go get that.
A few moments later.
I'm back. Sorry, I had to stop because the phone was ringing. I'm on my lunch break right now at work, recording this video, and the phone started ringing. If you want to make a movie that does well, right, with the public, that makes money and that allows you to make another film, and if you want to be like kind of a mainstream or like popular filmmaker, you want to be a festival filmmaker, right, you have to make movies that people are going to care about. So there has to be some degree of marriage between the kind of craft, intellectual, clockwork kind of aspects of making a film, of putting all the pieces together and making sure that everything works and stuff like that, and pure intuition, right? But you do have decisions to make in terms of which paths are you going to follow. Are you going to be a very cerebral, purely intellectual filmmaker, or are you going to be a purely intuitive filmmaker? Are you going to try to, meet in the middle? Like, how much of each are you going to put in here, right? That's kind of what 8.5 is about. Fellini wrote an essay. If I'm not mistaken, it's in the Criterion Collection Blu-ray release of Amarcord. I can't remember exactly. I read this essay at some point, like maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And he talks about how he had this kind of epiphany where he felt that he'd been being too analytical and too intellectual in his films, and that there was a sense of dishonesty in that as his career was progressing, and he was feeling like he wanted to move in this more purely intuitive direction. Then he made a film like Juliet of the Spirits, and then he made Satyricon and Amarcord, and all these films that are really driven by pure kind of artistic vision and intuition, right? So Fellini at some point completely abandoned the notion of being analytical of the film itself within the film, and that philosophical kind of self-conscious point of view within a movie. Is the person who wrote this about Tadashi Imai going to go and say that those Fellini films are not, they're subpar or whatever because they're focusing on X, Y, and Z instead of analysis of themes, right? So, and it's also interesting noting that, so for instance, Revenge, which is the Tadashi Imai film, which I saw this year, was written by Shinobu Hashimoto, who's one of the greatest screenwriters of all time. He worked with Kurosawa, like he wrote Rashomon and Seven Samurai, and the dude is like an absolute legend, right? The focus on, supposedly, on consequences over analysis is not solely the work of the director. If you're working with a screenwriter, if you're a writer-director, then yeah, it is. But the screenwriter does have a say in that and is part of that creative decision-making process, right? So right away, that quote is like, Tadashi Imai was not really, like a Tarantino type, or who was writing every single word of every single, you know what I mean? Like, that's worth bearing in mind. But also, I just feel like, again, it's an observation. It's not really criticism, and I don't really see that it's a valid point. If you kept going beyond that and tried to understand why that was, and if you understood more about the creative decision-making process, and you still disagreed with that process, whatever, fine. But like, if a filmmaker wants to make a movie that is purely driven by character and wants to observe character, wants to make a melodrama or like a humanist drama, a very compassionate type of film, or something like that, film that examines society and relationships, they're under no obligation to be intellectually analytical of the themes of the film. There's nothing wrong with pursuing cause and effect and what happens to people's lives and to societies, to groups, whatever, as films go on, right? Like, as the story progresses, it's not a criticism. It's an observation. I keep saying that. I guess that's the theme of this video. I'll stop now. It's been about 20 minutes. But I just thought it was kind of interesting to discuss these little points of criticism on Tadashi Imai that I found when I was reading about him after I watched Revenge. So my name is Will, and I thank you, as always, for watching the channel. It's been a joy to get to do this channel. I thank everyone who is here, who is watching these videos, who comments, and all that stuff. It's really, really fun to get to do this, and I thank you for that, because if you weren't here, I wouldn't be doing it. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.